Each individual within a connected society has 5,000 data touch points every day.
God.
So 5,000.
No wonder I'm so tired.
Why are we here, James?
I don't know. You mean like on the Earth?
Well, that's perhaps a bigger question than we're going to tackle today.
We're here because we're going to talk about data and the search for meaning and how important stories are to be used in conjunction with data.
So the world of ideas, the world of human stories, and how data and ideas kind of come together to create meaning.
Yes.
Sounds fab.
Great. Why do you think we're drowning in data and yet starving for meaning?
I think that you have to pull back and just look at the sheer quantity of data that we're generating. So we're generating something like 400 million terabytes of data every year. Each individual within a connected society has 5,000 data touch points every day.
God.
So 5,000.
No wonder I'm so tired.
5,000 digital interactions every day that generate some sort of data. So, you can, and if you think about that in terms of the sort of sheer quantity of data that's being generated by each of us through our smartwatches, our browsing, our media consumption, it's something in the region of 300 to 700 megabytes of data a day. So it's just this kind of raft of data. And I think the thing is that not only is there a huge amount of data, but it's being generated so easily and so cheaply that we've become kind of seduced by this sense that there's data set out there for everything. And many of our clients, I think, are sitting on this kind of trove of data. And often I think part of what they struggle with is trying to work out exactly what to look at within this mass.
What is really meta about this conversation is that you just threw loads of stats and data at me.
And how many of them are you going to remember?
I remember 5,000 touch points.
Okay.
But in half an hour I probably won't.
So
you want to tell a good story about that, don't you?
Yeah, absolutely. But I also wonder why that's the one that sticks. And I think when we start to dig into this,
personal, maybe.
Maybe, and I think as we start to dig into it, we might start to realise what it is that makes specific data points or specific kind of facts or ideas sort of stick. So I think within this mass of data, we've become sort of very seduced by the idea that all we need to do is find the key data points, and they will be not only the kind of markers of success, but will be really the things we have to latch onto. And we see this with clients all the time, trying to find their kind of unique KPIs. There's this book called Measure What Matters, which has become a really kind of sort of transformative book within the business space. And really it's all about kind of getting to your kind of key metrics, your OKRs, the key things you need to look at. And I think that sometimes what happens when you take that stance is that you kind of iron out all the rest, right? So you just go for these kind of key numbers, and sometimes I think we're looking at the wrong figures. I think within our own business we look at, for example, our social content, and it's really easy to get seduced by the likes. How many likes have you got? But actually, engagement is much more complex than just clicking a like, and everyone's sort of learning more and more about that as time goes on. I also think that within the world of technology and the kind of app space, often people are looking at daily visitors or daily users, whether it's a website, whether it's an app, but really, they're not asking themselves, like, who are those people? What's their experience like when they arrive at my site or my app? And how do they feel when they leave? And I'm much more interested in those questions than I am in just the sheer number of visitors. It's like, what's the experience like, and what quality are they gaining from that interaction with your brand? And I think that's really when you start digging below the surface, and really the data is often not very good at telling us that story.
We work on so many interesting projects for brands and non-profits, and I really love the ones where there's qual and quant and storytelling, because that's really where all of these things come together, isn't it? That's where you create meaning. And one of the things I think that's come up time and time again is these, like, the gaps between what our perception is of something and what the reality is. And I really love Hans Rosling's book, Factfulness. So I'm going to probably talk about him quite a lot because I love him. He's talked about the gap instinct, which is that people assume that there's the dramatic divide between different groups of people all of the time. And actually, even if you present some data that says that that's not the case, that people are the same on this X thing, they won't believe you. They can't, the data doesn't work. So you have to tell a story about why people are the same and that there isn't this huge divide.
I think it probably comes into looking at values, looking at things that kind of connect or divide us in terms of our kind of worldview and our ideology. And then you have to go beyond data, right, and start to understand those kind of stories, those values, those sort of myths that bring us together or kind of pull us apart.
So what about brands then? What do you think separates the brands that break through the noise and those that don't?
If we're talking about the noise of data, I think we're certainly starting to get to a point where within these conversations around AI that are so kind of prevalent within the culture and certainly within our sector at the minute, you're starting to really see people acknowledge the fact that broad data sets, that AI analysis tend to take you towards a kind of flattening out of detail. Tend to be good ways to get to some generalized findings and to get some kind of early sort of mass signals, but not really to help you understand the kind of meaning and the sense of difference. What we're starting to see is clients use AI tools and use kind of big data as ways to kind of almost develop kind of research proxies that can replace, a Gen Pop survey or a set of very generic focus groups. But what they are also often doing, I think, is using things like ethnography and semiotics as ways to really drill very deeply into the why, into trying to understand the symbology, the meaning, the kind of cultural nuance that really sort of colours the story, and using kind of big data and AI to really kind of generate some signals or some hypotheses, and then really using much more exploratory research to sort of drill into that to really try and understand what kind of lies beneath it. And I think that brands that understand that understand the need to kind of marry data with more kind of speculative exploratory methods are the ones that really win. I think also when you think about the idea of really what a brand and what a brand is, a brand really is, in its essence, it is an idea. It's a concept. It's a sort of story. It's a way of generating myth and cultural resonance that really connects with a group of people. So it's very hard to do that solely with kind of data and with kind of machine analysis. Really it is those kind of touch points, those stories, those imagination, those ideas that stimulate the imagination that really sort of draw an audience in. Can you give me an example of some time in your work where an idea has been sparked by a piece of research and it's become the thread of a story?
Well, I mean, that is literally the definition of my job, I guess. That's what we do in the studio, is we take the insight and the strategic recommendations that we come up with and we tell stories that completely embed all of that in them, but try to bring it to life in a human way. And that is so exciting. In filmmaking, if you're doing an interview with someone can say just one phrase and it will completely bring to life for you how the film should be told and how it should be visually represented. Because, for example, from November, the work we did recently around understanding the manosphere, young men's lives online and the effect of the manosphere on them and their health. We made a really beautiful film about that research, and there's this guy in the film called Will who is an example of something we call an ex-red pillar, someone who has interacted really heavily with the manosphere and then come out the other side. And when we interviewed him, he said he had a couple of phrases. He said one of them was that when after he was so deeply immersed in the manosphere, it was like a cacophony of voices inside his head. And for me, that was that's gold. That's like a metaphor that brings you some sort of stylistic device. So we overlaid images of influencers, fake influencers, over a shot of him just looking very overwhelmed. And you could have someone just talking to the camera and saying, I was very overwhelmed. And that wouldn't really hit home in the same way. So that's why metaphors and insight and interview transcript and all that, it's all used. It all comes together to create the way that we tell the stories.
Something that really struck me with that piece of work is that, that notion of the masculinity map that came out from Will's interview and then became a really central creative treatment for you has then become a little bit of a central kind of idea that in the rest of the content and rest of the conversation that's been emerging off the back of that film. So, Will was featured in the Telegraph, there's a profile in the Telegraph, and they used the masculinity map as an idea. And I can see it becoming part of the conversation, which is, I think, when you see these ideas become really powerful, so when they start to move, and I wonder whether it takes us to a place where we start asking ourselves, well, what does a new masculinity map look like? And it becomes a bit of a shorthand for the whole strategy and the whole worldview, which is, I think, when it becomes, really, really kind of transformative as an idea.
Yeah, it's really cool when that happens, isn't it? Because one person just says one thing and it becomes the creative spark, but it also maybe becomes the name of the film, and sometimes it ends up in the name of the report, and then you see it as a headline in a newspaper, and it's like, it's so fascinating the way we instinctively know when something has a deeper connection to it. I love it when that happens.
What is it about stories and ideas that makes them more memorable than numbers?
Yeah, well, it's biology, isn't it? It's who we are as humans.
There's a Daniel Kahneman quote. He's like the kind of godfather of behavioural economics. I'm sure, like many people know, no one ever made a decision because of a number. They need a story. Just to build on your point about biology, you know, there is this whole sense of understanding the way our brains make sense of the world is through language. You know, we're almost, if you think about the fact you're almost always talking to yourself all the time. You know, there is conversation happening within one's mind. It's the way that we're making sense of what we're doing. It's the way that we plan what we're going to do next. You know, it's all language.
Mm. Do you know there are some people that don't have an internal monologue? Oh. They don't have a voice in their head.
How sad.
Well, I just like, it must be quite peaceful, no?
Maybe, yeah.
Brains, biology, people, what does that mean for brands? How does a powerful idea, how do you define a powerful idea when you're working with brands and brand strategy?
I think in our work, really, the powerful idea is the insight or the cultural truth that really kind of then drives the creative strategy. And the powerful idea would, you know, sit within the creative agency or within the brand team themselves in terms of how you translate it into an idea that really kind of has traction. But I think, you know, the role that we play is really about trying to root that idea generation within audience and cultural insight, you know, to make sure that from the outset it's rooted in a kind of really relevant sense of what's happening, you know, what the audience cares about, what's happening within the culture. If there's a tension that we can really use to leverage that idea, and, you know, through the history of brand strategy, you know, this idea of finding a cultural tension that you can resolve or you can speak to is a really kind of tried and tested method. But unless you start with some exploratory research to try and understand that culture, you're kind of starting from nowhere. You know, we believe that if you bring insight and cultural understanding into the process at the foundation stage, then everything else that follows will thrive.
In some ways, powerful ideas is often just a human truth, isn't it? Where it intersects with a product or a service or a brand or how an organisation wants to communicate. That powerful idea has to have a human truth right at its core. So the work is about understanding what that human truth is within that cultural context, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. So in our work, where we often bring together quantitative data, big data, qualitative insights with rich storytelling, how has that played out and been a successful process in something that you've been working on recently?
Well, firstly, it's my favourite thing is when it has all of those elements all together. And so the Movember film that we made, that I talked about before, is a really good example of that. We were really keen to include the stats because they give a really strong sense, they're juicy, meaty stats, and they give a really good sense of the seriousness of the problem and the breadth of the problem. But as we've said, like there's an end point to how much you can get out of the stats. And then we wanted to bring in loads of the qual insights as well because they bring more texture to the stats. But it was Will's personal story that really helped us navigate the entire story of how young men engage with the manosphere. And so what that did as well is it drove media engagement. So, you know, the outputs for that, they could just sit on your computer or on your website, right? But really, if you're trying to drive impact, you need to reach audiences, whether you're a brand or you're trying to deal with a behavior change issue or a social issue. And so the stats kind of open the door to the conversations with media organisations. And then that really, really interesting story that Will told drove so much more of the media engagement. And that's fundamentally because you see somebody talking to you about something they've experienced and they tell it with emotion and you connect with them and you see someone you know in that person. You see your brother, your friend, your dad. You see people that you that may be experiencing the same thing. So I think that's a really interesting alchemy, bringing all those three things together, and when it works, it's beautiful.
So the statistics almost establish the context and the significance of the work. The qual kind of provides more of that kind of rigorous texture and depth, but then it's the human story that sort of like acts as the through line that takes you that brings it into reality.
Exactly, and also not to forget that it needs to be entertaining. You're not going to watch that film if it's not entertaining. So we employ storytelling techniques, narrative arcs that will resonate with people, that are tried and tested. And like the filmmakers in our team, they're people who've made television shows, you know. So it's really important that also it's an enjoyable watch, even if it's something really serious. So thinking about ideas and insights and this world of technological innovation that is just completely superpowered at the moment. How do those two things sit together?
What's really interesting is that if you look at the history of science fiction and sort of philosophy, you can see it's littered with examples where writers and thinkers have generated both concepts and language to describe technological futures that have become a reality. Cloning, android, robot, these are all terms that were coined in fiction perhaps 150 years before they appeared within the technological reality. So we see these examples where a speculative thinker, someone with imagination, has come up with an idea or framed some language around an idea that technology and engineering has then kind of rushed to sort of meet. And I think it's a really interesting moment in time we're at right now where engineering-based organizations are arguably the kind of fastest growing organizations on the planet. But actually, I guess there's a question about the extent to which those organizations are thinking about meaning and cultural context when they're thinking about what they do. I mean, there's also a couple of really huge concepts from the culture that are interesting. So World Wide Web, the metaverse, these things were named by writers like way before they became a reality. I mean, Edgar Allan Poe and Mary Shelley were writing about essentially artificial intelligence in the early 19th century, so far before it became even a technical possibility, let alone reality. So it's just really interesting to see how through history there's been this kind of pairing where philosophers and writers have kind of created meaning and conceptual ideas that we can latch onto and become and sort of imagine in our brains, and then engineers and technologists have made them reality. Often it is the technologists who are driving the agenda, but it's down to the marketeers and the insight people to find the meaning and find the relevance within the technology, to actually add the kind of symbolism and the ideas that will make it understandable and immersible and consumable really within the culture.
That's why science fiction is such an amazing genre, isn't it? Because on one hand, you get this imagining of how technologies can go awry and how desperately terrible things could be. And then you get this other end of the spectrum, which is imagining what a kind of brighter future can be because of technology. Some of my favourite literature is feminist science fiction, where it imagines a world where without gender discrimination, and in some ways it's when we imagine what is possible that we make it possible. Obviously it can go the other way as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, within this world, culture becomes, the way that we decode things. It becomes the way that we ascribe these layers of meaning to something which is technologically possible. A brand without an idea is just a bunch of stuff.
Did you know that the iPad, decades before it was ever invented, it was imagined first on Star Trek?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think within film and within literature, we can see some classic examples of this. I think I really always love thinking about 2001, this story about a rogue AI that was such a pivotal film of its time, and actually now we're worrying about the prospect of rogue AI, in our immediate future. So that film kind of predates that by decades.
I love a rogue AI in a film. Surely the best one ever is Ian Holm in Alien. The robot that just ends up spewing that white liquid is like so ghastly. I love it.
Well, what about the computer in Red Dwarf? Very much a kind of 90s, I guess, early 90s TV reference.
Holly?
Holly, this kind of very sort of like prosaic, everyday, slightly bored.
Yeah.
I love the idea of an AI being a bit bored by the people that it has to serve.
Yeah. Well, it's inevitable, it will be, won't it? Oh, that's a miserable thing to say. I'm sure we can cut that.
Okay, let's talk craft. I want to understand from you, what are some of the specific ingredients you look for when you're trying to create a compelling narrative?
Well, there has to be a narrative arc, and there has to be some sort of transformation, and ideally emotion and tension. And if you can get a dog in it, then you should. That's actually Alfred Hitchcock's words. He always said, always have a dog. So if you watch a Hitchcock film, there's always a dog. You can find a load of really good examples of this, of many classic thinkers that talk about narrative structure. First one is Todorov. Todorov talks about equilibrium, disruption, and resolution. And so that is obvious what it is, really, that it's a story where there is just somebody in their equilibrium, their normal life, and there is this huge disruption, and the narrative will be getting back to this resolution. And there's actually a more specific version of that structure, which is that you go back to a different equilibrium. So it's equilibrium, disequilibrium, equilibrium, but the equilibrium is different to the one at the start. So there has to be some form of transformation.
What I love about that is it actually chimes really well with behaviour change theory. Within the core of many behaviour change theories, there's the idea that we're in this point of stasis and we have to disrupt that stasis in order to get to another place. You know, that actually it's about unsticking something and then kind of re-gelling it, I suppose.
That makes sense. And also, well, because also the disruption is like the most compelling part, isn't it? That's something that we can all resonate with. Like, life is just inherently disruptive. So watching somebody deal with disruption and transforming as a result is really satisfying, because you think, oh, anything is possible.
I think it's also the hardest thing to achieve in reality, actually to try and engender that disruption. I guess that's what we're all kind of trying to do when we're trying to affect change.
Brannigan takes it even further. He says that a story is not just a sequence of events, but it's a system that organises meaning, so it's a kind of architecture. So that's what we're always trying to do. We're trying to take the insight and the strategy and these personal stories and not just string them together as a sequence of things that happen, but to actually impart some sort of meaning.
And what about Roland Barthes, king of semiotics? You know, he would tell us that stories are really kind of full of signs and codes and symbols, and really what makes a story stick is its ability to tap into these cultural myths, these deep-rooted stories that we use to understand who we are and the world that we are part of.
I feel like Todorov, Brannigan and Barthes sounds like this sort of beginning to a tongue twister poem, doesn't it?
Well, it's quite Dickensian, isn't it?
Or like a Dickensian law firm.
So what are we saying makes a story stick?
Well, it's structure, and it's surprise, like disruption, and it's symbolism. And the magic comes when you bring all those things together. So whether we're working with brands or non-profits, that we will always want our stories, the work that we do, to have impact and have some sort of output, right, that is useful for people. So how do stories translate into real-world action and positive outcomes?
I would guess at the core, you know, the story is really about activating emotion. And emotion is what drives behaviour. It's what drives resonance. And we know that, you know, through decades of science, behavioural economics, that actually often what we're trying to do, you know, whether we're trying to help a brand position itself or help a non-profit to inspire a broader sense of change, you know, what we need to do is land the story to act as the catalyst, to really be the thing that kind of draws people into it. I think the other thing is that, you know, often in the work that we do, our clients have stakeholders, and those stakeholders are thinking about tons of stuff. So their exposure to a particular problem or a challenge we're working on is actually quite limited. You know, they're not going to sit and get into the data set. They're not going to absorb a 100-slide deck and sit and kind of read it. You know, you get a very small window of time in which to really kind of capture their attention and to really get a decision out of them. So often I think our stories and our films are ways to get their attention, to sort of powerfully connect with them, and to actually inspire kind of action in them. That actually it's about capturing their attention, inspiring them to action, and it becomes the thing they remember. You know, it's the thing they take away is the character in the film, or it's the particular articulation at the end of a document that really kind of sums it up and brings the thing home. And often what we're trying to do, you know, the documentary work that you lead, often it's about taking skills and making content in a way that could appeal to a mass audience because it has that kind of beautiful sense of a sticky story, but actually it's about shifting the opinions of 5 people.
Yeah, I really love that in our work, how, you know, we produce these incredible decks which are really meaty and really important for brands and important for non-profits. They really give so much insight and so much ammunition for the work that they do. And then when it comes to making the film, we're often distilling that even further and finding that like powerful idea, that human truth right at the core. And yeah, I mean, all of our work, I love all of it, but I always feel really chuffed when I hear from clients that the film is something that they go back to time and time again, years and years later, which I think just speaks to just the human truths that we're talking about, the biology of how people find meaning.
Yeah, sometimes I feel sorry for the research team when we get to that stage in the process. So we've done a huge piece of research, quant, qual, semiotics, expert analysis, produced this very finely crafted document, and then it's done, delivered, and everyone gets obsessed with the 5-minute film.
Well, that's why it's so important that we all work the way we do, when we collaborate across the teams, because the films are not like things that it's not this thing that's produced separately to the research team. Everybody in the research team is involved as well, because you couldn't get to the film without that whole massive journey beforehand either.
I think it's so true, and you talked earlier about the fact that sometimes there's one phrase or one insight that really sparks the whole journey, and I think often, increasingly what we're realizing about our insight work is that sometimes, well, more often than not, it's an insight or a small set of really transformative insights that become the powerful ideas that really shift the needle for the client. And you have to go through this kind of process. You have to develop the full narrative and the full kind of understanding in order to get to that one kind of kernel, that one sort of nugget that becomes the thing that really inspires action. We often talk about the fact that there's a set of core slides in the deck that would be the ones that travel, and actually I love thinking about that when we're thinking about creating a deck. It might be a 100-slide immense debrief, but actually, like, what are the 4 slides that are going to live beyond? And I think that's a really important part of constructing the story from the research side of the business too.
What would be your one piece of advice for marketeers or strategists working today in considering how much data saturation there is?
I think it would be, to try and find what we call bright sparks. What are those key things that are really going to be the points of leverage that become these kind of critical stories, the critical points of understanding that clients will grab onto and that will really sort of transform their work. And that really takes partly understanding how to sort of sift through and find the needle in the haystack, but it also takes understanding their needs inherently at the outset, so what's going to sing.
I would say that the why cultural insight is so important is the dealing with hunches, because I think I see so much with marketeers and strategists, and especially in advertising actually, people kind of come to a creative solution for a brand that is based around a hunch they have around that audience and what they're going to find palatable and what's going to resonate with them. And they might be right, but you really, really need to check, because you could be catastrophically wrong. And we've seen it in our work, haven't we, before? People come up with creative solutions that we've then tested and found out that they are just like not the right thing to do at all. So having that cultural insight, that bedrock of information that's going to power that strategic and creative thinking is essential to not just make a complete massive mess of it.
I guess it's that idea that sitting with some foundation understanding and core insight, and then really kind of marrying that to the creative idea is really what makes things feel kind of like grounded and resonant, but also transformative.
This has been nice, isn't it? What a lovely conversation.
Super interesting.
I've got one more question for you. Which of us is the good side?
I don't know how to answer that question. Oh, I see.